Okay, I guess we can't wait forever. Let's go ahead and get started. So just keep an eye on assignments. So assignment number 4, I think it's due today, but I think most people already finished it. How many people already finished assignment number 4? Okay, most people. That's good. Assignment number 5 is considerably more involved. So these were only worth 5 points. This is 10 points. We'll go over this, but as you can see here, it uses code from today's example, and then I tell you to make some modifications. So there's that. And then I decided to do the midterm in 2 weeks. I was kind of deciding whether to do it after spring break, but I think we'll just have the exam before spring break. And then what I'll do is next week I'll do a review. Now, just to let you know, the exam is going to be very closely aligned with assignment number 5. Okay. So I'll give you something kind of similar. And what that means is to do your exam, you've had to have assignment number 5 completed and hopefully graded. So what I did is I made the due date on a Friday. Pay attention to that, okay? I didn't want to just make it due in exactly 1 week because I realized that can be a little bit tough. So it's due at the end of the week. I'll say that one more time, just I want to make sure everyone's very clear on this. So normally our assignments are due on Mondays, but because we have a midterm exam and because the exam is based off of assignment number 5, I realized that what will happen is a percentage of the class will wait till the day it's due, and if the day it's due is also the exam, it's going to cause some problems. Okay, so what I'm doing is making it due on the Friday before the exam. That way I can grade it for you, and any last minute mistakes that you might have made or misunderstandings you had, you can go and fix. That's kind of the compromise, because my other choice is to make it due in 1 week, which might be a little too fast. This way, this gives you a little bit of extra time to work on it, okay? Any questions on the date of the exam? I'll give you all the details about the format of the exam, what you can and can't use. I'll give all that information next week. And everything's streaming okay. No dropped frames. Okay. I think that's pretty much it. Any questions? Just to give you a quick preview, after the exam, after spring break, the course will kind of shift focus a little bit to work with another framework called Bootstrap. Has anybody heard of this before? Okay. Now, what we're learning right now are HTML and CSS standards. This is good information to know, but sometimes this is a little bit too low level for you to work with, and so they have all these different CSS libraries. The reason I make you learn the low level stuff is because a lot of these libraries use common conventions, like grid systems and so on, and it's better for you to know where all these came from. A good example is Bootstrap switched to Flexbox for a lot of things. And so you've done a Flexbox assignment, you've gotten some practice, you'll get some more practice with it today. Then later on, if you wanted to do something in Bootstrap with Flexbox, it's going to be very simple because you've already gotten a bunch of practice with it. Versus if I had never taught you how to use Flexbox and you were trying to learn that and Bootstrap at the same time, it can be very frustrating. But the reality is that in practice, many of you will just use a high-level CSS framework. So the focus of the course will definitely shift after spring break, and we'll also do some WordPress stuff too. By the end of the course, the goal is that you have created your own WordPress template, what they call a theme, rather than having to use off the shelf. But we'll get to all that later on in the semester, but I just wanted to give you a quick preview of how the rest of the semester is going to go. How many people are graduating or plan to graduate this semester? Okay, so probably more than half. keep tabs on all these due dates, okay? I just don't want to have any last minute emergencies of somebody who's supposed to graduate and then they, missed an assignment or a couple of assignments. And, if you fall behind, let me know sooner rather than later, okay? Because graduation is like a set date, so it's not like we can push it back or give you an incomplete or anything like that, okay? I think I bought us enough time. Any questions? Okay, so we're probably only going to get to, I think, 2 examples today. That was my plan anyway. But the second example is very involved. Now, it's very easy to fall behind on this second example, again, because it's very involved. It's going to be the closest thing to a real world web page that we've created so far. But that means it's going to be a lot of code. It's probably going to be a couple hundred lines of code realistically. Okay, so I'm going to try to move slowly, but raise your hand if you fall behind, because it's like if you fall behind in the first couple of minutes or first 30 lines of code, it's going to be difficult for you to follow the rest of class. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and open up brackets or do our usual stuff here. So we've got make a folder for today. Today is the 24th. Go ahead and open up brackets. File new, but don't paste it in an HTML shell just yet. There's something I want to go over. Because there's a new setting that we're going to have to start setting with an HTML shell that's going to give us responsive design. Is that still okay? It's not too dark for anybody? Not going to put anybody to sleep. Okay. So everyone's all set up with brackets? You got everything's up and running? Okay. So let's do this. Let's go to HTML shell. Or let's, how about we do this? We can use W3 Schools. Okay, so inside of Blackboard under Resources, you have a link here for Media Queries. So you can go ahead and click that if you want to follow along. So as you can see here from the title, we're going to be talking about responsive web design. In the early days of the web, and I think I've alluded to this several times, is that there wasn't a huge difference in the different monitor sizes. Like I joke, it was like, your web page was going to either be viewed on a 15-inch monitor or a 17-inch monitor, maybe a 19-inch. Like there was a very, very, very small difference. And so what was one of the techniques that we learned? So by default, when you have HTML, it's going to want to span the full width of the page. Now this can be difficult for a lot of people on the design side because you never know how your page is going to look. In a magazine or a newspaper, you have set dimensions. You know exactly how it's going to look every single time. It's a newspaper. It's not like it's going to magically change. The web isn't like that. But, so what they did is came up with this technique of creating a fixed width div to accommodate, say, a 15-inch monitor. And if you had a monitor larger than that, what did we get? We got some extra stuff on the side, and we usually did like a background color or something. But it usually worked out because we had a fixed width div, and that was that. We knew exactly how it was going to look because there weren't a huge number of device sizes. And what pretty much made that technique, I don't want to say useless, but it definitely changed things. What creation or invention? Phones, yeah, mobile devices in general. And so we went from having to, decide if we're going to display on a 15 or 17-inch monitor. Now we have to go from the smallest, cheapest phone that you get, those like prepaid phones and stuff that you can get, those smartphones with the tiniest screen ever, all the way up to giant 8K TVs. Now realistically, every web page isn't going to design for those two extremes, but maybe if you're Amazon or somebody, you actually might. But we no longer have that simple option of just saying, oh, okay, make a fixed width div, and that's that. So what do we do? Well, there was a whole period, and I remember this because I've been a web programmer for many, many years. One of the things that people were doing for a while is they would create a separate version of the site for mobile. So much so that I remember they were going to have special domains for mobile. I want to say it was .mobi, and everyone was buying up .mobi domains. It's kind of funny to think about now. But it was like literally if you had a phone, you went to the mobile version of the site. If you wanted a desktop, you went to another. For obvious reasons, this should be obvious that it's not super practical to do that, to have two completely separate versions of your site. Every time you have content changes, it just becomes impractical very quickly. What people were noticing was that, hey, well, there are certain things I can do to make it kind of work okay on both large and small devices. One of the most obvious is that when you're on a mobile phone, do you have room for multi-column designs? No, generally things are single column. And I kind of said before that potentially you might be designing for these 8K big screen TVs, but in practice, that's kind of the rare case. Usually what you're targeting is desktops and laptops, maybe tablets, and mobile phones. And realistically, it doesn't really matter if it's the largest iPhone or the smallest prepaid phone. You're still just going to collapse down to a single column. And you can see that generally here is that what they started to do, and at the same time, by the way, HTML5 started to become popular. So there was a huge period in HTML where it was very stagnant. There was nothing new going on. The browsers, I don't want to say they were terrible, but they weren't super great. Microsoft had essentially decided they weren't going to do much else with Internet Explorer. I think they saw the web as just being finished or complete, and they're like, okay, that's it. We don't need to make any improvements to the web, the browser, or anything like that. Actually, a few companies can be credited with really pushing the web forward. One of them definitely is Google, and to this day, and it should be for obvious selfish reasons. Why does Google want to push the web? It's because they don't make an operating system like Microsoft or Apple. So how do they distribute their software? Through the web. So things like Google Maps, they want to be as good as possible, and Google Maps is kind of the extreme level of sophistication. So they're like, okay, we need new standards, we need new tools, we need new things to be able to make our software work better. So there was a period of, I don't know, around 2010, something like that, when the first iPhone came out. There was an adjustment period, and I'd say probably in the past 5 or 6 years, maybe even 7 years, we've kind of settled on this idea of responsive web design, is that we make one site, all the sites share the exact same content, and what we generally do, you can get more complicated as needed, but in general what we do is we just say, okay, we set these things called breakpoints, and at certain breakpoints we just reflow the same content. So what I mean by that, here you can see, I don't know what this is supposed to represent, maybe navigation, some side content, a footer or something like that. And then you can see what happens here is that on a tablet, it would just take that same content and reflow it. Same thing here. Now often what we'll do, and here's the actual example. Now often what we'll do is just something like 3-column design, 2-column design, 1-column design. And if you're keeping it simple like that, some of these frameworks like Bootstrap are actually really, really good at doing that, okay? So how do we do that? How do we automatically reflow this content? Well, one way is to, so if we click this Try It Yourself button, this is probably the most complicated way to do it. There we go. Okay. So you can see here what they're doing actually is, I want to say they're doing this with floats or something like that. I thought I saw floating in here somewhere. Yeah. They're floating all kinds of stuff, but you can see here, this is relatively complicated code. And okay, what if you didn't want, you know, this system of columns or whatever? It's very fragile, it's very hard-coded. But you get the idea that it's not moving. There we go. When you hit a mobile device, this is how it would look on mobile. So you get the idea. It's automatically reflowing. But using this method right here is extremely complicated. So we're going to have some terminology here. You're not going to really use it very much, but you just need to know the term. You're going to see it in the code. So now we're going to start talking about the viewport. So the viewport is the user's visible area of a web page. Probably sounds overly technical than it is. I think it's just the visible area of a, you know, of the page. It's the screen essentially. What we're going to have to start doing is if we want to have, okay, so does anybody remember the early days of smartphones when you used to visit a page and the IRC page was like this as of like a year ago? When you used to have to, like, you used to get a shrunken, scaled down version of a page and you'd have to pinch zoom your way through the page. Does anybody remember that? I know that's going back quite a few number of years now. Show of hands, does anybody remember that? Okay, actually a few people. You don't find yourself doing that very often anymore, right? Most web pages, you know. So this is this setting right here. Is this actually says, okay, sorry, let me mute my phone. This actually says, okay, I want the scale. I don't want to have to do that whole pinch zoom thing. That was just necessary in the early days of mobile web pages because people weren't really designing their web pages and their websites for iPhone, the original iPhone. But now what we typically do is just every site, we just assume that we're going to be designing it for responsive design. So every page from now on, from going forward, we have to put this meta viewport name. Now that may seem like a pain, but in reality, when we're on HTML shell, all that translates to is this third setting right here. It says include viewport meta tag. We're going to start clicking yes to that. And that automatically includes that setting for us. So ideally, when you create your page, you have the same content, same HTML, 95% of the page is the same. All you're going to do is change a little bit of CSS on different device sizes. How can you detect different device sizes? Well, if you remember with like Flexbox, we can actually automatically have it wrap around. So we could do something like that. The problem is that that's a little unpredictable. We get odd things like if we, you know, where we have 3 columns and then that fourth one kind of wrapped around. And so it can be a little bit awkward sometimes. With HTML5 and CSS3, they introduced something called a media query. And it should be pretty obvious what this is doing. It's saying, okay, only apply this CSS for devices from 0 to 600 pixels. And then we wrap it in curly braces. And then only in the case of, say, mobile phones, is that CSS going to be applied. So if we click try it yourself, we drag this back and forth. Notice that as soon as we hit 600 pixels, and let me explain this a little bit more. Okay, so here's our normal style. Should probably make this larger. Okay, so here's our normal style, start and end. Very simple tag. We've got an element selector, and it says make the background color light green. So by default, our background color is light green. What does the media query do? The media query says, okay, so it reads top to bottom, and it sets this rule. And then it says, okay, overwrite this rule when the device sizes are between 0 and 600 pixels. And so when we're down in 0 to 600 pixel territory, you can see the background color is light blue. Now, quick thing. Remember that when we're overwriting CSS, we just override the things that are specified. So what do I mean by that? I think it's text decoration. Yeah. Okay, so by default, it's going to be light green, and the text is going to be underlined. However, when we're at 0 to 600 pixels, it's going to be light blue. But what's the text decoration? Is it still underlined? Yes. This is going to be a very powerful tool because a lot of times we'll have a very complicated rule with like maybe 10 things inside of it. And literally the only thing that we want to change is maybe the width. So it makes it so that we don't have to re-specify things over and over and over again. So let's take this and let's copy. So we're at W3 schools. So there's a link at the bottom, media queries. W3 schools, 1, 2, 3, 4th N, media queries. I clicked the. Did I just click the very first thing? I think I did. Yeah. So click the very first, try it yourself. And let's take that, Control A, or Command A, Command C for you. Paste it in. And then we're going to save this as ex1.html. And let's take this a step further, okay? So by default, there we go. And notice that it's got our viewport scaling for us. Okay, so let's write our own. So let's say, for example, another breakpoint, let's say 900 pixels. So we say at media only screen. Don't worry about this. We're going to write only screen every single time. So it's just one of those things that we can copy and paste. And then what we do is in here we say max width 900 pixels. So the rule in these curly braces is only going to get applied from 0 to 900 pixels. Now we can actually flip it. There's also a min width, what's called mobile first design. I actually don't, as popular as it is, I don't really like mobile first design. But anyway, the difference being is that in one, you assume that you're on desktop and you make all your rules for desktop, and then you override for mobile. versus the other way around. I found it in practice that it's just a lot simpler to start desktop first, because a lot of mobile is just taking what's on desktop and squeezing things down to a single column. But it's hard to invert it the other way and take single content that's supposed to be for a single column and try to expand it out. I found it just easier to collapse it down, but it's just a preference, I guess. Now you can actually do between as well, but maybe we'll get back to that another time. Okay, so let's do this. So we'll say, okay, for body, I want the background color something very distinct. Dark orange, that works. And let's go ahead and run it. Okay, so you see right now it is light green. I don't know how well it's going to work with this built-in web server. I might have to just let's do this. I'm just going to open it from the file system. That's a little bit more dependable. So we hit our orange, and then once we hit 600 pixels, does everyone see that? So 600 pixels between 600 and 900, and then 900 plus. It may not work with the built-in web server in brackets very well, I don't know. That web server actually has a bunch of debugging tools. It actually does a bunch of magical things in the background that you don't see, so sometimes you're actually not getting a true representation of your actual page. Now let me ask you this question. So don't change your code. Let's do this. Okay, so don't change your code just yet. Actually, I think this is about as much as we're going to do with this example anyway. So right now we're saying by default, it's going to be light green. And then it says, oh, okay, well, if your device is between 0 and 900 pixels, I want it to be dark orange. And then it's overriding that, and it's saying between 0 and 600 pixels, I want it to be light blue. Now, the ordering of these is actually important. Trying to think if this will, okay, so this will say between, yeah, okay. Sorry, I had to make sure in my head that this is going to work the way I think it's going to. Okay, so this is normal, light green. It never did orange. Does anybody have any idea why it never did orange? You have to be very careful about these rules. Okay, what I usually like to do is just maxed width in descending order. So it's saying, okay, if it's between 0 and 600 pixels, so let's say, for example, our page is 500 pixels, okay? So between 0 and 600 pixels, make it dark orange. And then it overwrites that rule and says, okay, if it's between 0 and 900 pixels, make it light blue. Well, is 500 between 0 and 900? Yes. So it's like this rule never actually existed because there was like this overlap with this rule. So if you don't understand what that is, what I would say is just make a little note to yourself, either mentally or on a piece of paper, is that the best way to do this, if you want to follow a pattern, I like patterns because it makes it harder to make obvious mistakes, is just use max width and then the pixel sizes in descending order. Makes things a lot easier. Okay. I think that's about all I want to do with this example. Any questions? So the idea is going to be, when we create our page, is that all of our normal CSS that we want to apply everywhere goes here. CSS specifically, say for tablets, is going to go here. But we don't need to rewrite all of our rules. We can just rewrite the things that matter. So say, for example, we're doing grid. Well, say, for example, normally our grid is 4 columns. Remember that property, grid template columns? Well, we don't need to rewrite the entire thing. We just need to reset grid template columns to be 2 columns instead of 4. So literally, we just need to set that one property. Okay, so this becomes very powerful and convenient that we can just set a couple things here and there and have probably, if I had to make up a number, 98% of our code is the same. We just need to make minor modifications to say, okay, this content's going to go over here, this content's going to go over here. Okay. So knowing that, let's go ahead and do File New. Go over to HTML shell. This is very important or else it's not going to work correct, is that make sure that you have this include viewport meta tag. Make sure that's clicked yes. So this will be ex2.html. Okay, just to double check, make sure that you have this here, that the initial scale is set to 1. So let's start off our site by saying, okay, let's start off at the header, the navigation, okay? And the idea is that we're going to have, kind of think of it like a 2-column setup, is that on the left half of our page, we want to have the logo, and the right half will be the navigation. Let me see if I can find a page that's similar. I think the Audubon Society is actually kind of like that. Yeah, something sort of like this. Theirs obviously is not completely 1/2, but something like a logo over here, some navigation on the right-hand side, okay? So let's start off with, we know we should put it in a header of some sort. Now, usually you'd make this an H1, but I hate working with H1s without using CSS resets. So we'll just stuff it into a div. And this is going to be our logo. We'll just put in text and say it says IRSC. Again, normally we'd use an H1, but H1s have so much automatic formatting that we're going to spend, just extra lines of code trying to make it work. There are CSS frameworks out there like Reset CSS and Normalize That CSS that'll help us with that process. But just for now, we'll keep life simple. And we're going to make a class later for it called Logo. So we'll keep that there for now. So that's going to be the part on the left. The part on the right is going to be our navigation. So we've done this a few times. In the real world, you would actually make an ahref, but just to keep the code a little bit simpler. I think 4 should be a good number. So now inside of the head section, let's go ahead and add our style. And remember, we talked about this before. This is one of the unfortunate things that we have to deal with. So you say body in HTML. I don't want that to have any margin or padding. Now we've done this, so by default, unordered list has a bunch of things associated with it, like extra padding, extra bullets, all that sort of stuff. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, the unordered list underneath navigation. Well, first of all, we want the list style type to be none. And it's going to have some margin and padding. I want to zero all of that out. I'll worry about that later. Let's just zero it out. It's probably not a whole lot to look at just yet, but I guess we can open it, see what it looks like. Okay, pretty much what you would expect. We haven't really done any styling just yet, but at least we got our links. The bullet's gone. You can see the margin padding's gone. That looks good. So the idea is that I want the logo on the left and my navigation on the right. So what I'm actually going to do is make a Flexbox with 2 items. This is going to be the first item, and all of my links are going to be the second item. Why can I do that? Well, I'm going to put the Flexbox on header. I'll say this a few times because, again, like I said, this is going to be a little bit more complicated of an example. So remember, when we make a Flexbox, I should probably have some of these links up. I think it's over here somewhere. Perfect. When we have Flexbox, we have our parent container and our individual items. So what I'm telling you is that the parent container is going to be header, and I'm going to have 2 items. What are those 2 items going to be? This div and nav. Remember how Flexbox works. It's not going to work on these individual LIs. It's going to work on div and nav. It's going to treat nav as one unit. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's not like going to go down all the way to the shoulder end. It's going to say, okay, div is one thing, nav is one thing. So let's go ahead and set that up. So put that here. And since we know we're just going to have one header on our page, you could create a separate class, but I'm just going to do this directly on header. And what I'm going to say is that I want displayed to be flex. And just that alone should get us almost what we need. But by default, it's going to be, I think, begin or whatever it is. What we want to put them on separate sides is that, remember, we have justify content. We'll put a space between. And see what that did is that shoved everybody to opposite sides of the page. Okay, and every once in a while, I'll just take like a 1-minute break just to make sure everyone's good on coding. Because again, this example is going to grow to be fairly large. Is everyone good? Okay. So now having these all the way at the edge of the page may not be exactly what I want. Yeah, it's kind of responsive, but often what we do is we still have a container, and we just reset that container at different breakpoints. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's also make a class called, I'm trying to think the best place to put it. I think I want to put it up here. And this is just going to be our classic container that we've done before. We set the width, and let's say 1200 pixels, and margin auto. So where do we set this? Well, in my opinion, a pretty good place might be header, because header is going to kind of squeeze everybody in. And it's going to get both things, actually. So it's going to get that it's container, but it's also going to flex the items inside. So this is a good example of when we're actually doing multiple things at the same time. Header acts as a container, but it also is displaying flex. It's our Flexbox. Yeah, question?
What was the dimension for margin in the container class?
Right here. Let me see if I can keep both on the screen. And you can kind of see that here is that they're shrinking, they're shrinking, they're shrinking, and then eventually at 1200 pixels, we're going to have some problems. Okay, we'll address these later with media queries. Now, it should be obvious that I don't want these links stacked vertically. I want them horizontal. What thing did we learn a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, can we use to make them?
Wasn't it column and rows?
So what did we just use a minute ago? Flexbox. We can actually use Flexboxes within Flexbox. So this thing right here is one big Flexbox. All of this is header. But then we can also say that I want these links to be inside of their own Flexbox. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and do that. I think we're going to put it on, yeah. So what we'll do is we'll say that the UL, this is going to be display flex because directly underneath these, so this is going to be the container, these are going to be the items. So inside of here, we'll set it to display flex. So we're getting there. We're getting closer. Now, if I want to spread these out a little bit, I can also, remember, justify the content, space between. So let's go ahead and do that here as well. But the problem, nothing really happened. What we want to say is take up as much as you need to take up. So what I mean by that is that inside of header, I've got this div and this nav. And they're right now really only taking up what they need to take up. So what we have to do is for the nav, there's this property called flex. You can almost think of it like, remember in grid, you kind of said take up how much you, like the fractional units. It's kind of like that. And what I'm saying is that I want that nav and this nav and this logo I want them to both flex 1, which essentially means I want you to take up as much space and the ratio is going to be equal. We set this property on the children, not the container. The individual items, we say how much we want it to take up. And magically, you may not see it, but we've got like a 50% down the middle here. We've got this all the way to the left. And because they're both flex 1, they're taking up as much as so they each get half. And then we get this. Does everyone see that? Let me go over that one more time because I realize that's kind of complicated. So on header, we set display to flex. Header has 2 direct children. What are the 2 direct children? The div and the nav. Yeah, exactly. And we gave this a class of logo. So we said, I want the logo and the nav. I want them to take up as much space as they can. And here's the ratio. And I'm basically saying they're going to be even. Now, I could have changed this. I could have said, okay, have the logo take up more. And we get something like that. That actually might be more appropriate. Let's actually go ahead and change that. I like that a little bit better. Yeah, so I'm basically saying the logo is going to take up more room. We may change it back later. Let's see how it looks when we get going. Now, a very common design that we've done in the past was our background color. And we wanted that to be the full width. And the problem I run into, so don't write this, but some sort of blue, something, sky blue is good. But the problem I run into that is that background color doesn't run the full width of the page because container doesn't run the full width. So what do? We have to wrap it around in kind of a dummy container. And I'm just going to make this a div. You could argue that maybe we should have done this on the header instead, but some of these decisions are kind of arbitrary. That's why we have div. Div is very generic. And then div, we're going to say style equal to, and then we'll set the background color. Something greenish. Forest green, I guess. And obviously that makes the text unreadable. So everything under header, let's go ahead and just make that color white. So let's go back to header. Logo, let's go ahead and give a large font size. Maybe bold it. Let's keep on going here. Let's go 40 pixels. Let's see where that gets us. That's about right. And then under nav, we can go a little bit smaller. 30 pixels or something like that. I'm not trying to be exact here, but I'm just at least trying to get it readable. You know what we'll do? We'll be lazy. We'll because we're gonna have some vertical alignment issues that we have to go back in our Flexbox and fix. So let's do this. Let's just be lazy and let's make them both the same size. Okay. Maybe we'll fix it later. The main goal is just to at least make our stuff readable. Oh, that's too big. Let's go 35. Yeah, let's go even further. Let's go 30. Okay, that's good enough. And then inside the header, maybe I want to give it some padding, so it's not like right up against it. So let's say padding 25 pixels. So if you set it like this, this will set the top and bottom padding to 25 pixels, but it'll say, okay, just leave the left and right alone. That's probably too much, maybe 20 pixels. I'm just trying to get rough estimates. Whatever, close enough. Okay, so this will be kind of a pause point here. Let me go ahead and double check all your styles, make sure you've got everything here. Yes. Yeah. Is everyone good on CSS? Okay. Now, in reality, I tend to actually usually make class names for everything. So this nav I would have probably made for a class for it called like primary nav or something like that, but that's all right. So this is okay, but we still have the same problem that we ran into before, is that it's 1200 pixels wide, and this doesn't work that great. So what we can do is we can go back and we can, right here, before the end of our style, add media queries. And just so you don't mess up typing, if you want, you can copy and paste it from, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Let's just type it from scratch. Because I feel like there's almost more of a chance that you might mess it up. So you say, don't worry about what this is. And maxed width, say 1200 pixels. And so we're going to say from 0 to 1200 pixels, where does 1200 pixels ring a bell? Well, that was our container width. So what this means is that once I'm smaller than 1200 pixels, I know that's not going to really work anymore. So what I can do is I can say, okay, shrink the container. I no longer want it to be 1200 pixels. I want the width to be 700 pixels. And then notice at the breakpoint, we might have to shrink these links even more. Okay. Actually, let's go ahead and do this. Remember on, we had Flex 2 and 1. I had a feeling that was going to cause problems. That was on nav. So under logo, instead of Flex 2, just set it to Flex 1 so they're even. Just give us a little bit more room. That should do it, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so all he did was under logo, changed it from Flex 2 to Flex 1, so nav and logo have even screen real estate. Okay, and you can see that the container shrunk at that specific point. But we run into the problem again at 700 pixels. So what do? We do the same thing at 700 pixels. So you can almost think of this as like desktop, tablet, mobile phone. But rather than shrinking it to another pixel size, what we often do is, because we know we're going to eventually be dealing with single column designs, is just to say that make the width 100%, which is the same thing as just saying I don't want like a specific pixel width. It's just going to take up the full width because it's going to be a single column design, which we'll get to later. Okay, so everyone's good with these media queries. Make sure you type them out correctly. Double check, so this one's going to be 700 pixels, this one's going to be 100%. And make sure when you actually do this, now you'll notice these are going to kind of cramped up together, and in reality, on a mobile device, we don't tend to see this links like this. They tend to stack vertically. So if you remember, we had header is a Flexbox with two children, this and this. So what we can do is we can say, okay, add another rule here inside of, you can think of this maybe as mobile, and say, okay, once I've reached this, normally the flex direction is row, but once we've reached this point, I just want the flex direction to be column. And so let's try this again. Now these two should stack on top of each other. So we're almost there, but the last piece that we need is for the links to be vertical. So where did we set that? We should maybe given this a class name. So we'll do this again. In retrospect, it probably should have had a class name, but that's all right. So set that to column as well. So we're saying that our two children and our header are going to be columns, and then our individual links to be columns as well. By the way, this is about as difficult as it's going to get. From here to the midterm, and then it's just all kind of the same. And then after the midterm, we're going to be dealing with these high-level CSS frameworks that make life a little bit simpler, okay? So just keep in mind that it's not going to get increasingly difficult. It's going to kind of flatten out here, and then the stuff after the midterm, I think for most people will tend to be simpler. For most people, I can't, guarantee, but I think most people in the past, when I taught the course, have found Bootstrap and WordPress a lot simpler. Okay. So we're getting there. And this doesn't look super great, but it'll work. What we typically actually do, and this is on your assignment, is that we have show hide. So there'll be a JavaScript button. Now this is not a JavaScript course, so I'm not going to get into that. But some of you will look that up. And what you'll typically do is once you press that button, it'll collapse all these links to where you can't really see them. Does that make sense? You've probably seen this on websites before where like right there would be a button, and then these would be links. Okay. Okay, so I think we have as much as we need for the header and navigation and all that stuff. Now the second part of this is going to be we're gonna make a grid. Okay. So just underneath this, let's just go ahead and put a little H1. It's like Indian River State College. And we can just center this in the middle of our page. That's fine. You could give it its own class, but we'll just say style, text, align, center. If you ever just need to center the text and it's in block level tag, you actually don't need to resort to all these margin auto and all these other things. You can just do text align and it'll center the text. It's only when you have more complicated things with, but here all we have is the text. So can't forget the simple things, You don't have to get into fixed width and putting in a container and margin auto and all that. We can just put it in the center. Okay, so here's going to be the setup, is that we're going to have a grid of some sort of stories. We'll just keep it generic. And each one of those is going to be an article of a class called card. Okay. Now, we want this to line up in the middle along here. So we'll have our container. So the very first thing is I'm going to put this all in container. And I guess this is kind of our main content, so I guess this is a good spot to put it. So main class is container. Now I think I can get away with this. We can actually apply two classes. So we can say it's a container, this is also going to contain our individual stories, our news articles, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to call it stories. And this is going to be a grid of stories. From there, we're going to have a bunch of individual articles. So I'm going to have an article. At the top, there's going to be an image. And we can use the pixum.photos. And we want it to be overly large. This will make sense later why we need this, but it's actually going to be larger than it needs to be. So we've got our, I'm going to go very slow. We've got our main with the class. The class is container. Remember, container just holds everything. And then stories. Stories is going to be our grid class that we'll define later. We're going to have a bunch of articles, but right now we have one article. It's got an image. Let's also give it the class card image. And our article, I don't know if we'll necessarily need this, but let's go ahead and give that as a card. Just very briefly, we tend to call these things right here cards. It's not really an official name, but it's just something people call them, okay? So we've got our main, we've got an article that's going to be a card, and our image, and this is a naming convention you'll see sometimes. It's basically saying that it's an image inside of a card, even though it's not official. It's just, you're kind of grouping them together. And we'll be very generic. We'll just have H1, we'll just have it say my story. And then a paragraph of lorem ipsum. So this is going to be like our point to take a break for a second, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So I've got main. Main's going to contain a bunch of articles, but right now it just contains the one. That article is of class card. It's going to have an image, again, but this time class is going to be card image, and then we're going to point it to pixum.photos. It's going to have an H1 kind of acting as a title that says my story, and then one paragraph of lorem ipsum. But don't forget, you could have 5 paragraphs in a single article. There's nothing, it's just more convenient. Otherwise we have a bunch of code on the screen and it just makes it more difficult. And it's not going to be, because we haven't written any of this CSS just yet, except for a container. Just make sure that if you bring it up, you get something like this. Okay, you've got your image is actually showing. You've got your H1 that says my story. You've got your lorem ipsum. Make sure we haven't cut out here. Everything looks good. Okay. So everyone's got this. You've got the image, the H1, the paragraph. Okay. It's very important you have it correct, because what we're going to do is we're going to copy it 4 times, or a total of 4. So copy and paste 3 times. We want a total of 4 articles. So make sure that, first of all, that you've highlighted the correct parts. And then when you paste, we're going to paste inside of main. So we're going to take this article right here, copy, and then we want 4 total. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. I realize that's a lot. It makes it very busy, but it's difficult to do some of these examples without a lot of content. So we've got our main, and within main, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 articles, and then just make sure that you are very careful in that pasting of the article that's inside of the closing tag of main. Now, if you look at it, there's not going to be anything terribly interesting because, you know, we did what we told it to. So I already told you that stories is going to be a grid. So let's go ahead and define stories. So we'll say stories. We know it's going to be a grid. And if you remember, what we have to do is we have to set the grid template columns. We have to say how many columns wide it's going to be. And let's just say, let's just do a 4-column design, okay? So say grid template, columns. And remember, we can use that special unit fractional. We don't have to use percentages or pixels or anything like that. We can use the kind of the grid way of doing things. And we can say that they're all going to be of the same size. So again, we created a class called stories. We said, okay, I want this to be a grid, and I want the grid template columns. I just want a 4-column design. Now we run into an issue in a second here. Well, running into the issue now, but we'll fix this in a second. So you might think, oh, we used very large images. It was something like 800. I don't remember exactly what, there it is. 800 by 500. That's a very large image. We don't really need that large. One of the things that we can do, though, is what are called responsive images. So if we go back to W3 Schools, and we have a linked right here, responsive images. What we can do is we can take an oversized image and we can have it dynamically resize as necessary. So what we can do is we can say that the maximum width is going to be 100% of its container. Right now, this is actually overflowing its container by a lot. So we say we want it to be 100% of its container, and then recalculate the height. That way we don't screw up the ratio. So we just set that to auto. Now if you remember, we thought ahead, we made this special class called card image. And so now if we go up here and go ahead and fill it out, we can go ahead and set that. So we said set the max width to be 100% of the parent container that's the container that it's sitting in, and set the height to auto. Now when we go back, what happened? It resized the image as necessary. Now you have to be very careful because it actually downloads that full large image. So you can't set, a ridiculously like 8K image or something, some crazy image or something like that. But for the most part, people have relatively fast internet connections. So if the image is just like a little larger than it needs to be, and we'll see why this is convenient later. So it's okay if the image is a little bit larger than it needs to be because it's going to solve some problems for us later. Now, everything is kind of running up against each other. So you remember we had a property, it was called grid gap, and it sets the gutters around the cells of the grid. So let's go ahead and inside of stories, let's go ahead and set that as well. 10 pixels should be good. Gives us a little bit of breathing room. You could do some other stuff with it. You could round these edges out if you wanted, like using border radius. There are a couple of things you could do, but you get the idea. Okay, so this is a good breathing spot again. I'm just going to slowly scroll through the code, make sure everyone has everything you need. Yes?
So I have everything except that I did for the card image section, but it's still stayed the same size, but when I reload it, it goes to that tiny.
Let me see.
Yeah.
Let's see here just to see if that is.
Mine's doing the same.
But it's yeah. So it's still like that, and I never even.
So you set it on chart. Scroll down. Scroll down to where we oh, so I used the short word IMG instead of the full word image.
Well, mine said like the 2/8 slip around, and I don't know what you were, word image. So it's also.
We're super close to the end, so I would say what I'll do is I'll post it and then we can take a look at it after. Yeah. Okay. Let's do this because I have a feeling now we're getting to the point where like we've got a lot of code, and coding all it takes is one little tiny mistake. As usual, I always post these code examples. So if yours is like looking crazy and not doing what it needs to, we've got maybe 5 more minutes of coding. So just follow along. We really don't have that much left. And then what we can do is after lecture, you can if you want to try to fix your own version, you can, or you can just grab the version I post. Okay. Okay. So for anybody who's like, if you want to double check your code. I'll just keep this up here. Okay, well, I'll just finish this out here. Okay. So we're close. But the issue that we run into is that our grid is not responsive. I mean, it kind of is. By the way, notice how it automatically resized those images. That's kind of a nice thing. But if we're on a tablet, we typically don't have a 4-column design on a tablet. So it'd be nice that on a tablet, we could collapse it down to a 2-column design. Okay, so all we have to do for that is this represents 0 to 1200 pixels. We'll pretend that this is our tablet size. And then we'll say, okay, stories. And all we have to do is set this one property. We just say grid template columns. It was set to 4. Remember up here it was set to 4. Now all we have to do is set it to 2. Does anybody remember from last week what happens if I've got 4 things and 2 columns? what happens after that? Like I place my two things, what happens next? Goes down to the next row. So what I'm saying is that I want this to be 2 columns. Because I have 4 items, what's going to happen is once I hit tablet size, I've got my 2-column design. And because I had 4 things, after I put 2 things in there, 2 cards, it wrapped around. If I added another couple of cards, it would have wrapped around. It would have kept on going. Okay. So we're almost there. The one final thing that we want to do is we want to do the same thing here, but now 1 column. So now when we're on mobile, this gives us a 1-column design. So desktop, 4 columns, tablet, and then mobile. Okay. And I realized that was a lot, but that's probably the closest thing to a real world example. Obviously, there's a lot of detail work to be done. That's what, if it was an 8-hour day, we just spent an hour just getting the layout. You'd spend the rest of the 7 hours on the details. But that's pretty much it. And again, that's about as complicated as we're going to get. So I realize some of you might be a little bit, that might have been a difficult example for you, but just kind of hang in there, because after the midterm it gets not easy, but easier again. Okay. So let's look at your assignment. Is there any one piece of code that doesn't make sense that anyone want me to explain? Let's do the quick summary, okay? So we started off with our header. And remember, the whole idea of container is it's just like a fixed width. And because we have this new thing called a media query, that width can change. And we made a logo, but I put text in here, but in the real world you could put in an image of some sort, and a navigation. And on the header, what we decided to do was we said, okay, let's make this a Flexbox, and let's make the logo half and the navigation half. And we also said, well, we can actually put Flexboxes inside of Flexboxes. And so what we did was, because each one was taking up half, I said, okay, I want to put these links inside of a Flexbox. So on this unordered list, I also said, you're going to be a Flexbox as well. And what I want you to do is spread, in the flex direction as row, which is the default, I want to spread these out evenly. So it gave us this kind of half and half thing right here. Now the issue that we ran into was the background color. If we want to do dark background, light text, we can't do the background on the container because it's not the full width of the page. So what we did is we wrapped it in kind of a dummy div that all it does is set the background color for us. We also did some stuff with media queries that we said change the container as needed. And then once we got all the way down to mobile, we set the flex direction to column from row. That way it collapses down to this. And again, in the real world, you'd add a little bit of JavaScript to have a show hide button for when they want to navigate. Those little, they call them hamburgers. It's like that 3 lines, 3-lined icon. The second part was we set up a grid. And we had main. And remember, I told you that we could actually have 2 things going on at the same time here. is that we could have our container holding all the content. And what's great is because we're using class names here, container is already responsive because we already put in media queries for it. So it's automatically going to change size as needed. And then we're going to create a grid called stories. And then we had a bunch of individual articles inside of that grid. And we actually didn't end up using this class called card. We could have actually gotten rid of it. And then we made 4 of these. Then we set up our grid. And we said we wanted it to be 4 columns with a little bit of extra space around, so we set our grid gap. And when we tried to view it, the problem we ran into was that the images were oversized. So rather than trying to precisely size the images for every single breakpoint, we saw that we can actually have these things called responsive images, where we set the width to 100% of its container, so it's going to fill its container, and set the height to auto. That way, it just kind of automatically adjusts the image size for us. And then finally, when we had that much, we said, okay, well now what I want to do is as the screen size gets smaller, collapse this down to 2 columns, and then collapse it down to 1 column. Sounds easy when you say it in words instead of code. It's like 133 lines of code that took about 30 seconds to explain, but that's just kind of how you have to think a lot of times is high level, and then you spend a lot of time in the actual coding part of it, okay? So any questions? Let's briefly go over, everyone's good? Okay, let's briefly go over the assignment, and then I'll give you a break, and then you can work on the assignment for the rest of the class. Okay, so use the example from today as to start. Change the layout from a 4-column design to a 3-column design. And the idea is, so here we went 4, 2, 1. With this assignment, you're going to go 3, 2, 1. And what I'm saying now is you have to have 6 cards total. So before we had 4 cards, should be kind of a trivial change. But this is kind of like it should be one of those things that is so easy that I think you're overthinking. It's just a copy and paste. Okay, if you're having trouble with it, I think you need to go back and review some lectures because it's kind of a just copy and pasting code. Do like you did before, add a footer. The styling should be similar to the I called it the banner, but really the header section. This is the important part. So now you're also going to change the breakpoints to 1,000 pixels and 600 pixels. But you can't just do that. You have to make other adjustments. So you can't just go in here. Okay, I want to change this to 1,000 and whatever. What did I say? 1,600. You can't just do that. You have to do other things as well. Now, I don't want you to shout out the answer, but it should be kind of obvious that if you scroll through the CSS, you see references to other pixel values. So that should be kind of a hint that you have to change those as well. And don't just kind of look like just randomly change them or anything. Try to really think through what's going on with some of these pixel values and what they represent. And then if you do the show hide JavaScript thing, that's extra credit. But only try to accomplish that if you've really, you feel really solid on the rest of it. And as normal, add margins, padding, color, all that sort of stuff is needed. Maybe fix some of these link sizes and so forth. Some of the stuff we didn't really have time for in class. Okay, you get the idea. Any questions?
You said if our code was whatever, are we going to reuse that code that you did use, or are we?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll post this right now. And if your code's like off and you can't quite find what's going on, just take this as your starting point. So I'll post this right now. Actually, let me do that. So I'm going to stop recording.